You think you've grown familiar with every tragedy in the West? Not yet. The cross stands in the sand, the burnt-edged board, the mute child, and the tar-pitch smell clinging to the heart. I thought I understood the law of the wind, until the grain revealed the handwriting of my own hand. Stay, wait for the well rope to strike once, then fall silent. I saw the cross before I saw the child. The wood rose above my head, planted deep, standing straight like a boundary stake. The face was smooth. Where sunlight licked across it, it shone like fish oil. Along the shaft ran fine, even swirls in the grain, the kind that only show when someone has rubbed it many times in the same rhythm. The early day wind was dry, carrying a tar-pitch smell like the one I'd caught before in long-stored beams, glue asleep in the fibers waiting for fire. The board hung in front, of different grain, thin, its edges softened so they wouldn't cut the hand. Black letters pressed flat on the face. Return when you're perfect. The burn lines were steady, unshaking. The letter edges sealed by smoke, a kind of writing that outlives ink. A thin cord tied the board. The rubbing had worn a shiny track into the shaft. The child was tied to it, arms draped over the crossbar. The rope was coarse as horsehair, chafing the small wrists, teasing out threads of gold. Dirt from the desert and wood grit clung to the nails. The nail edges nicked as if bitten against stone. The face was caked with dust and dried salt. The eyes did not leave the board, as if the look had been hung there before I arrived. The horse under me lowered its head. Its ears flicked twice and then stilled, not blowing out. The skin of its neck was hot, the smell of saddle leather cooking under the sun. A black fly landed on the edge of the dried crust at its nostril, then left, the buzz thin as a cord pulled through a nail hole. There were no fresh wheel ruts nearby. The sand kept only a few shallow old boot tracks, their edges licked down by wind. A scrap of black cloth was caught on cactus spines a few steps away, the edge untorn, as if placed and forgotten. On the ground, the cross's shadow lay to one side, its edge eating into the tiny burrow mouths of scorpions. I saw the burrow's shadow darker than the woods. I pressed my heels lightly. The horse stepped. The saddle gave a short, cort creak. I dismounted, reins over my hand. The sand drew in under my boots, making a faint breathing sound. No birds, no cowbells. Only the rope's stretch and slack, bit by bit.
Cracked lip parted then closed, leaving a pale line. A cord at her neck looped behind it, holding a small bone, the size of half a thumb. A lamb. The bone's edge was worn, polished, and at one corner was a very fine notch, as if someone had tested a blade there and stopped. I drew the small knife from the leather sheath. The edge still held the grainy feel from its last honing. My hand found the place where the thumb braced the spine. I set the blade at the knot behind her arm. The rope was not fully tight. It had loosened in places, the kind of slack left by someone who'd pulled many times and knew where the strain wouldn't hold. When the blade slid through, the fibers parted like dry straw. A brief heat of cut hemp passed my nose, quick as a blink. Her forearm dropped first. Where the rope had bitten deep, a dark band remained. The rope teeth pressed into the skin like steps. I cut the rope on the other side. Her body leaned. Her eyes stayed on the board. I cut the belly rope. She fell almost entirely into me, light enough that my shoulder bone hurt from expecting weight that wasn't there. I heard bone tap against my shirt, a hollow knock. Her breath struck into my collar, hot, broken, with the smell of dry iron and tar pitch. I set her down for a moment. The small legs trembled, but didn't try to stand. The toes gripped the sand and slid again. She curled in, arms holding her belly as if to keep something from falling out. The lamb bone thumped her chest each breath, making a soft lock-cock, like a dry kernel hitting a tin bowl. The board in front hung lower now, its cord loose. The black "return when you're perfect" burned into the eyes like scorch marks on a stove-side plank. I touched the edge lightly. The sanding was the kind done by someone afraid of skin tear. The knot sat to the right, not centered, showing the tear was left-handed or had meant it to swing away from the chin. Habit is a drawn-out letter. It writes itself into objects. The girl's eyes followed my finger to the board. Her gaze shifted slow, like an old face pouring through a new one without blending. At the rims of her eyes, dust had settled in thin lines, hardened like salt on a glass edge left too long. Her lashes stuck in small bunches, each holding a single grain of sand. The horse shifted. A front hoof scraped a shallow line. In it, the damp layer beneath showed, darker than the rest, a rare wet trace left from the night. I heard the wind pass through the cross, low and long, sliding into the drilled pinhole, like into the throat of someone keeping a vow, unwilling to speak it twice. I didn't ask where she came from. I didn't ask.
The shaft near the base at ground level ran crosswise scratches, even parallel. Marks from other ropes, older, higher, lower. A history not written in dates. The soil around the post's foot had sunk little, meaning the hole was dug deep, the footing solid, the setter skilled. That kind of knowing needs no face. It lies in the way a hand bears on a hammerstock, the way eyes square the post, the breathing when the knot is drawn tight. I lifted her. The weight pressed into my arms, then went hollow, like lifting a heavy coat without its wearer. Her head rolled over my shoulder, hair against my neck, dry, brittle, the smell of sun breaking apart in small shards. The bone at her neck rasped my breastbone. A faint sound, like salt sliding in a glass when someone twists the base. I led her toward the horse. The horse tilted its head, nostrils shifting, catching the smell of smoke and pitch. I set her on the saddle. Her back curved to the leather, legs finding no place, and I had to set her knees with one hand while the other kept her from sliding. The reins drew in slightly. The saddle gave a second cort sound, longer than the first. She looked at the board again. The body didn't move, only the eyes, quick without pause, like the way one glances at their name on a gravestone to make sure the letters are still there. The thin breath from her mouth fell onto my wrist. So little I had to tilt my wrist to know she still breathed. I pulled out a worn strip of cloth and tied it across her and the saddle. The knot found my fingers by itself. The motion went down slow, certain, as if I were tying something I had tied many times in another place, with another person, or with this very shape on a day without me. I didn't look up. I didn't want to see the shadow of those black letters fall across my wrist. The wind flipped the edge of the board, showing the back for a moment. On it, beyond the grain, I saw a blade test line, half-curved, not joined at the ends. Not everyone tests a blade that way. I had seen myself do it. In my head, a small door opened, leading nowhere, only letting the wind pass through. I stood again before the cross. The sun slanted, the edge of its shadow cutting across my ankle. The dried resin on the shaded side had hardened. Pressing a nail into it left no dent. On the crossbar, a few hairs were caught and held by resin.
glinting like fine metal strands. At the bar's end, the axe bevel had bitten into the corner, leaving a torn shaving, the clean kind only made when the blade is still sharp. I looked up at the join of the two timbers. There was nothing there but a round wooden pin, driven flush. But from here, it was like a third eye, closed, awake. I didn't believe in omens. I didn't believe in a man's word.
At her neck bounced to her shoulder and fell back to her chest. I reached to set it right. My finger hit the notch at its edge, deeper than I'd thought. That was a human mark. Someone had held a blade and stopped exactly there. The stop is always the truest part of a cut. I passed the strap under the horse's belly, tightened the second notch. The leather was hot, felt like placing a hand on a sleeping animal you didn't want to wake. I braced her neck with the scarf. The scarf was wet through, leaving a dark ring on my shirt. That ring was like the water circle at the bottom of a tin cup I put on the table each morning and forgot. I reached to pull the board's cord from the cross. Not yet. My hand stopped halfway, in the air, like a blade paused before a swirling knot. The black letters stared into my eyes. Fine dust in the sunlight hung between my eyes and the letters, like a thin glaze over a truth no one could lick clean. At the post's foot, a line of red ants carried a dead beetle across, changing course exactly where the shadow of perfect hit the ground. People say ants can't read. I didn't read it to them. I only watched how they reckoned when faced with something unseen that made them break rank. The sand under my boots sank slightly, like an exhale. The horse snorted once. From somewhere, far or near, came a single hoofbeat. Then nothing. The desert likes to bring sounds and leave them midway. I turned. My hand still held a piece of cut rope, 2 joints long. It had snagged in the tendon line of my palm, leaving a pale groove. I took it off, slipped it into my pocket, for no reason. Things like that tend to find their way home, even when no one calls them. I took the reins, turned the horse from the cross. The shadow of the black letters peeled from my back. Before stepping, I looked again at that join. The small notch I'd seen before, the half arc, was still there, like a toothless smile. I didn't smile. I made no gesture at all. I only set my foot down, letting the leather boot meet the sand, in a dry sound like striking a tin pan. The girl clung to the saddle, not to me. Her hands found exactly the worn stitch line on the saddle spine, nails hooking into the raised thread, holding. Each time the horse stepped, still black, their shadow still on the sand. The wind passed, the letters shook one strand of hair, then held still. I didn't look back again. Ahead, the land opened in pale bands. Gray-green brush bled into the harsh yellow of sand, the far edge whitening like salt. A blackbird crossed, its shadow falling onto my rein hand, cold as a drop of water on a thirsty day. At my side, the knife sheath touched my rib, reminding me of the uneven grind along the edge, where the blade wore more from stopping there often. Behind, The cross shrank, but its shape didn't. It jumped from wood to shadow, from shadow to horse's back, from back into the dip between my shoulders, and lay there like a name without sound. The lamb bone knocked steady. I felt that beat would find its own way, no matter which way I pulled the reins. No one blessed the ride. No word began it. On the board's face, the black letters were mute, and mute was the loudest way they spoke. I shifted my hips to balance the saddle, let go, heard the leather creak once. I didn't think about returning. The desert doesn't like promises. It only keeps the fine notches lying in wood, in bone, in the words left unsaid. The horse went, I went with it. What stayed behind stood upright, taller than a man's head, smelling of pitch, black letters unfading. Somewhere between noon and dusk, a shadow cut across a road with no name. I didn't count. I didn't check the time. I kept my hand on the reins, tight enough not to fall, loose enough for the wind to pass. And each time the lamb bone struck the saddle leather, I heard it like someone knocking on wood in an empty house, once. Then silence. In the kitchen, I set her on the wooden chair against the wall. The chair gave a faint, dry sound like two bones meeting. She held her belly back, not touching, eyes fixed through the square pane to the yard, past where the well rope hung slack like a neck tendon waiting to be pulled. I pumped water from the hand pump. The handle rasped thinly, iron on iron, the dull hitch in the sound rising and then fading. Water fell into the tin cup, the surface thin as a cold coin. I set the cup before her. She didn't drink right away, only tilted it, looking through the stain at the bottom, as if at a miniature well. Her cracked lips opened a narrow line, closed again before touching the water. Slow, with a short breath in the root of the tongue. The cup touched the table. A dim ring had time to print itself, clinging to the crosswise grain. That grain followed the rhythm I had once rubbed, now strong, now light. So at the corner, a small cross mark showed when the ring first met it. She tilted her head over, darker than her true skin. Two tight bands, like jewelry that can't be taken off. The skin between them was oddly smooth, as if the sun had forgotten it. I heard a fine fiber still caught in the skin's crease, rasping against the torn hem of her dress like a cricket pressed under a finger. At her throat, the lamb bone lay right at the hollow above the sternum. The bone was polished, the edge notch a fine line, as if a blade had tested there and stopped. Each time she inhaled, the bone slid up, half a grain of rice, fell the same, tapping her own bone with a sound almost not there. From her skin rose the pitch smell, mixed with the damp metal of well water and the aged wood scent of the table. The stove was cold, black soot clinging in a fine line at the pot's rim, like a pen stroke someone started and stopped. Outside the window, dust rolled flat across the yard, passing the shadow of the open gate. The kitchen door stood ajar, hinges silent. I heard the house breathing, wood, nails, rope, water, each holding back a sound, trading places with the others. Things that know their place need no name. She sat, both hands over her belly, thumbs locking over forefingers like trapping a caterpillar. She lifted the cup, tried a sip. The water touched her lips and vanished. No drop spilled. The bottom left a second ring, overlapping the first into a loose figure 8. She set the cup half a body's width aside, as if testing whether the new ring would match the faint cross in the grain. Her gaze still went through the pane, holding to the light gap between two porch posts, where their shadows crossed into a familiar shape. I opened the skewed cupboard.
The edge scraped a thin line into my hand. Inside was a bundle of papers tied with old flax. The wanted poster lay on top, its edges worn as if many fingers had passed over it. White beard printed in faded black ink. The eyes blurred as if someone had rubbed them. The printed name and the hand-signed name, a habit that always travels in pairs, like a shadow with a man. I set the paper beside the tin cup. The drying ring pulled the paper's edge up slightly, like wanting to bite the news. Her finger, thin, nails chipped, old scratches lined like stitches, touched the beard, stopped, then slid to the lamb bone at her neck, touched the notch, stopped. I didn't ask. She didn't look at me. Her eyes moved from paper to bone, as if walking a trail she knew by foot. In the yard, the well rope rasped against the stone rim. A single thock, clear, not long, fell just as she lifted her hand from the paper. That sound, the letter E. There the paper was worn pale, the place where some past reader liked to rest a finger while reading aloud to himself. Each time someone read aloud, the paper thinned. The old reading stayed in the fiber like salt in damp wood grain. Wind slid through the kitchen door's gap, shifting the ash trace on the table a hair, revealing the grain beneath, shifted into a clearer cross. She looked at it, unblinking. Her eyes had no water left to blink or sound. From her throat came a dry note, like a grain of sand falling into an empty cup. I saw the vein at her temple push against the skin, then draw back, taut and fine as a bowstring held too long. The nail that hung the tin cup on the post had turned slightly at some point. The cup trembled faintly. Luck cock, twice. She turned her head at it by reflex, like a fawn to a bell. I didn't name the bell. Here, people don't name the sounds used for training. The cup stopped. The first ring had nearly dried. The second was drawing into the grain, leaving a pale rim like an upturned fish scale, closing. I stepped onto the porch. The wind shifted. The pitch glue smell mingled with the hot dust rising from cracked earth. At the fence, fresh hoofprints, sharp, edges unbroken, lay over the old, making open loops. In one place, a hoof had landed right in the water ring I'd spilled the day before. The dark of damp soil was torn by the fresh mark, showing a brief moss green before it closed. Wind slid through, laying the dust flat like a mourning cloth. On the cactus spines, the scrap of black cloth I'd seen that morning now sat lower, as if pressed by a fingertip. The edge was untorn, the corner folded as a tailor tests a needle. The third fence post from the corner broken before now had a new timber driven into place, its end still chalked. A slanted P, the chalk dust clinging to the groove like salt at a glass's edge. I touched it. The dust stuck at once cold and damp on a day without damp. Behind me, the kitchen door opened a little more. She ran out, hand snatching the board I had brought back, and left at the edge of the step. Looking at the black letters, she set her finger on the knot, exactly where the cord had just rubbed. Her lips shaped, perfect, without sound, only the mouth shape of someone who had practiced too many times to get it right. The board was light, I knew, but the edge sanded smooth was not a stranger's hand. Along it was a single cut line, like the mark of someone who often stops the blade midway to listen to the wood. She pressed the board to her chest, turning so the light caught the surface, the letters turning white in reflection. Her eyes swallowed the word, one measured bite. I heard fine sand tap against her bare feet, like someone sprinkling salt on a wound. The well rope outside shifted position, made no turned over. The horse turned its head, gave a low whinny, enough to shake one grain of dust from its mane. I saw a small scorpion run across the hoofprint, stop exactly at the overlapping marks, turn 3 circles without head or tail, then slip into a crack in the earth, Even those who follow a set path must relearn their steps when the path changes its sign. In the kitchen, the tin cup on its nail made no sound, but the light from its mouth swept a faint round onto the wall like a blurred halo. The pale ring on the table had tightened, leaving a white rim like salt crust in an old window grill. The board in her hands, the bone at her neck, the word in her mouth, each set in its place, asking no one. I went into the shed. The door scraped the dusty floor, stirring up a fine drift. Light speared through a crack in the roof, laying strands of still light in the air like the web of someone who didn't live here. The wood stood stacked against the wall, ends marked in chalk. My P was a little different on each end, on stiff-handed days, on easy-handed days, but the rhythm held. I took a piece, turned the face grain. The fine swirling jumped like fish eyes under water. The same rhythm, the same cut. Straight grain roughs like hair strands where I'd planed against the grain to make it take sun still lay there. On the shelf, the tin of steel brushes I'd left since last winter was still there. At the rim was a pale red bloom like rust, not as full as blood. I set my finger to the bristles, one broken wire pricking into the skin, sharp as a needle from inside. The smell of old pitch glue rose, entered my nose quick and stayed, not leaving. The new post I'd brought in from the fence earlier leaned in the corner, chalk still on the end, P still clear. I blew lightly. The dust floated slow, clinging back to my lips with a trace of salt. I touched my tongue to it, tasted like salt in well water being stirred. The chalk had been in my mouth already. The letter had been in me before. On the workbench, a scrap from a broken board lay pinned under the sharpening stone. Edge sanded soft, a stopped cut line, exactly like my habit of listening to the wood before switching hands. The light on the cut made it shine halfway, like an eye changing iris. Behind, the wall carried the shadow of the cross I'd taken down last month to reset the pin. Two beams crossed, round pin, like a bean driven into a shallow hole. The lamb bone I'd borrowed from her neck lay on sandpaper. The fine notch at its corner fit neatly into the crossing, didn't press. The dust parted in a circle, showing the wood beneath smooth by many steps. It was an old crossing, not new. It had been waiting here a long time. An old lizard slid across, head touching the chalk P on the wood's end, stopping as if to read, then moving on. Its tail swept a fine line through the shadow crossing, erasing part of the small cross I'd just seen. I didn't redraw it. What is erased is always clearer than what's newly written. At the shed door, the wind carried in a scrap of a human voice from far away, or very near. Couldn't tell. A word half pronounced, a phrase half said. I kept my hand on the bench edge, counting old sharp cuts with my nail, each cut a beat. When I'd counted them all, the well rope outside struck thuck once on the final beat. I carried the chalk-marked wood to the fence, propped it against the broken post. The P on its end faced the P on the post someone had set this morning. The slant of the two letters differed by 1 degree, like two mouths praying the same prayer in different voices. Wind blew. Chalk fell lightly onto the back of my hand, settling exactly at the pulse. I went back to the kitchen. The tin cup hung on its nail as before, its mouth tipped slightly toward the light. No water inside. The pale ring on the table had hardened to white, holding a point where the grain crossed. The board lay flat on the step, letters face down. She sat where she had before, hands still on her belly, eyes fixed on the light gap between the two posts. I returned the lamb bone to her. Her fingers locked the cord, lifted it to her neck, set the notch against the skin. She looked up at the cup, then the table, then me. No words. Only three things in place: cup, bone, wood. Three things enough for someone to relearn kneeling without being told. In that silence, the wind was cut by a shadow crossing the gate. No footsteps, only the shadow. It stopped exactly where the cup's ring on the table was drying, then went. The house let out a long breath. The well rope made no sound. Her eyes closed half a second, opened. No one explained anything. Enough. That was all the rising needed. Cup to make a ring, bone to make a notch, wood to hold grain. The letters don't need the person. The person only needs to set the thing in place. The rest, the house will do. The desert will do. Under my feet, warmed as if someone had just stood there. The gate's shadow stretched, its head set exactly on the stone at the well's footrest, like a finger pointing down. The well rope made no sound, but its shadow fell on the wall inside the house as a slant, like a blade test mark. The white-bearded man glanced at the staff leaning in the doorway. Same sheep's head, same fine notch, same polish oil. He didn't ask, I didn't explain. The wood answered for both of us. My fingers found the worn edge of the porch post, the groove in the grain matching my knuckle, like old boots fitting a man's foot. In the saddle, his stirrup swayed half a dust mote, enough for me to see the horse's eye blink once, slow as a man gauging distance. Their black coats weren't for mourning, they were for not holding light. Each cloth edge swallowed a fraction of the sun, returned the fish oil sheen on the sheep's head. He tipped his chin very slightly, the way one lifts a glass before setting it down. No hook in the words. No God in his mouth, at least now. There was staff, there was nail, there was smoothed wood, things that spoke better than words. Behind me, the kitchen door opened another finger width without a sound. The pitch smell from inside crawled out an arm's length, mixing with horse sweat, into a language I'd heard for years. I let my eyes drift to the right-hand man. Nails cut short, salt crust at the joints, the black cloth fraying where it rubbed the saddle leather. They arrived like the marks I'd once rubbed into wood, unhurried, but long without leaving. He called a name with no surname, voice smooth as a well lid sliding into its groove. He spoke of lost sheep, coaxing toward the house. His words didn't push, they set, like a board hung on the right nail. I shook my head, low as wind breathing at the edge of sand. The covenant of water still stood here, his eyes tilted toward the well as reminder. I nodded. Two men led horses to the well's edge, backs to the house, shoulders round and black, whole, without brakes. The bucket's lowering was slow, the rope rolling over the stone rim without sound. Pale green bubbles rose once and vanished. The water's face was cloudy, but reflected enough. At the well's bottom swam an upside-down black word, Sepharep. The word wouldn't stay still. It turned like an eye set, wrong way. A bubble ring circled it, making it white at the edge, black at the center, half alive, half dead. I stood off to the side so light from the porch gap cut across the well face, splitting the reversed word into two halves. On the porch step, the board lay askew, its letters face down, but the letters floating in the well were its face upside. What lay face down here stood up there. No one lifted it. The shoulders of those bending to drink made a short curtain. Their throats pulsed, swallowing well water like swallowing a line already learned. Boot heels scraped stone. One
Staff on the white-bearded man's lap tilted a fraction, the sheep's head catching the light, throwing a small, round, white spot onto the wall, falling exactly in the corner where I often hung the tin cup. That spot stayed still, like the mouth of a cup without the cup. He spoke again. The word family slipped through his teeth as light as dust through a door crack. A man to the left cleared his throat, hand going to the gun leather, then pulling back. I could smell oil in his palm. The gun was tended. So were the words. I stepped back half a pace, enough to see the water's face without bodies. The reversed word was still there. A light wind changed course, the surface wrinkling like skin after fever. The word broke apart, then gathered again. In the gathering, I saw a faint cross cut across to Freep, its center lying exactly where the pinhole I'd seen in the morning had been. There was no cross there, only light and water rehearsing a shape. I spoke a short sentence in place of refusal. No invitation, no banishment. The door still stood ajar, but the opening was for wind alone. The white-bearded man curved one corner of his mouth, a smile like a plane blade skimming wood across the grain, smooth, but leaving a fine hiss. He didn't press. The black coats drew out a thin wave of dust, then stood still. The wind would come when the house opened itself. I entered the kitchen as one sets down a spoon, without clink. My shadow went in first, cutting the tabletop, before stitching it back together with the light from the window. She had folded herself under the table, back to the wall, knees pressed in, the tin cup cupped between her knees like a lid capping sound. The cup's mouth was black inside, outside catching a dull light ring like cold silver. Her fingers held the cup without tremor, nail edges carrying soft dirt like ash. She didn't look at me. Her eyes moved past the doorway to the sheep staff propped against the wall. The light skimmed the sheep's head and wet out. Her hand touched the lamb bone's edge, pressing exactly at the fine notch, pausing there for one pulse. Her lips shaped perfect, without sound. Only the mouth shape to a word already placed inside. The board lay on the kitchen chair, letters face down. The board's corner rasped the wood with a faint sound when the house breathed. I picked it up, turned it like a man turning his own face over water. The back was smooth, but not clean. Near the wood answering in a low note. At the well, a drop fell into the water, sending a ring across into the shadow of the window, cutting in half the mirror that held the reversed word. Inside the ring, the word's part turned white, running quick like a sheep bolting. The outer part deepened, black as a freshly dug hole. I lifted the board high, let the light through the roof crack strike a cut. The half curve in the grain took the beam, closing the circle in my eye for one beat, then breaking clean. That was the first shatter of shape, the unfinished making itself whole when light passed through, then returning to unfinished the instant the light shifted half a degree. No human hand joined it. She looked up at me in the moment the light joined the cut. Her eyes were black, but the white thread in the sulra stood clear,
like a pale grain in a pine beam. Her hand left the cup, touched the board, not the letters, but the cut itself. A child learning to read the mark of a blade before learning to read words. I lowered the board, letters still face down. My fingers stayed at the edge, skin grain running with the wood grain, for a short stretch. The sheep staff, leaning against the wall, tilted very slightly, its head rolling a hair's width. The oiled shine sliding on the lime-washed wall, to leave a bright mark, shaped like a blade. I looked at that mark, remembered the day my hand had set the polishing cloth to the sheep's head, like stroking the hair of the dead. Out in the yard, the black coats shifted formation by half a step. No one knocked, but the door inside opened another notch through her eyes, pupils widening, corners narrowing, the white thinning. That was the second break. They didn't need to come in. The shape had entered the house long before, by wood, by cut, by a pale ring on the table. I left the board on the chair, tilting it so its edge brushed the wood, for the house to hear. The tin cup between her knees moved 0.5 millimeter, the rim showing a thin silver band. My hand on the table felt the crossing of wood grain, forming another cross, faint enough to need long looking. Crosses were in everything: water, light, dust, grain. No nail, no God. At the doorway, their sheep staff left his thigh, lowering the head as if at an unspoken command. The sheep's head turned toward the kitchen, the exact spot where one, then still. I stood, hand on the table, index finger resting in the sharp grain cut of my own making. Where a man's hand rests, the object remembers. Where the object remembers, the man will one day find his way back. No need to ask directions, no need for salvation. Outside, the black coats stood like markings on a carpenter's rule. Inside, the cup, the board, the bone, the staff sat in their places, each giving off its own faint light. From here, all lines had been drawn. Only the walking remained, walking toward the form already set in wood, not in words. The hoofbeats drew closer, then stopped, as if someone had placed a stone on water without letting it go. I slid the bolt to the middle notch. The door caught at its familiar halt, neither open nor shut. The small click dropped to the floor, rolled into the table's foot. My hand on the worn doorframe found the groove as the pulse slid into it, like a thread finding a needle's eye. I led her out the back way, past the trough still wet with early sky. On its surface, the pale blue lay thin, streaked into silver threads by the wind. A fly landed on the water's edge, its feet setting 5 dots before it flew. The dots didn't sink, only stayed on the surface like bits of lead. The pitch smell from the kitchen followed us, mixed with the cold iron scent from the pump, the mule dung, and the cloth left too long in the sun, each smell holding half a sentence not meant to be read. The back fence had lost a post in last season's wind. The two left standing threw crossing shadows on the ground. The black was so sharp I could see the dust standing inside it.
She didn't climb, she knelt in that shadow. Her knees set at the crossing as if chalk-marked. Her palms not fully closed, knuckles dry as roasted corn. The bone at her neck lay in the shadow's hollow, the fine notch catching the light in reverse, into a thread so thin you'd lose it if you blinked. I stepped back half a pace. The trough knocked softly as water tapped the wood in the wind. Inside, the tin cup on its nail made no sound, but the old ring on the table was drying to leave a white rim. The rim matched the grain into a tired cross, like a gatekeeper, dozing but still upright. The well made no thock. Enough. I steadied her shoulder so she wouldn't fall, my hand not touching the bone. Dust from her closer. 6 black coats, split into 2 lines, opening a path for the wind to cross the yard. Dust settled slowly, like sifted ash, not quite moving. One man brought down from the saddle a small cross of fresh pale wood, the pinhead still smelling of live resin. Another set a coil of rope by the gate, thick, evenly twisted, unsalted by sweat. No one looked toward the kitchen. No one touched the child kneeling in the shadow. The hand holding the rope let go, fingers clicking dry like a cooked bean. The sheep staff on his lap tilted a fraction, its head as if sniffing the house. The white beard blinked once. The black coats turned their horses in unison, without orders. Hooves struck the ground, a low sound enough to shake a rim of soot from the kitchen pot onto the table. They went. Dust laid on the ground like a blanket over the sick. The resin smell from the small cross pushed into the kitchen scent, setting a new line over the old, over. I carried the small cross onto the porch, set it against the wall. The broken hinge's shadow on the door fell onto the cross's head, adding another mark to its shape. The rope lay coiled, the top loop open half wide, like the mouth of someone halfway through a thought. Wind passed through the kitchen door's gap, brushed the strand, pulling a dry thread sound like hair being combed on a broken comb. I sat on the step, back against the post. My name hung out in the yard for a long while, like a sign not yet taken down. The house kept his questions stored in the rafters, not dropping it. She still knelt. The shadow shifted very slowly, the crossing of the 2 beams sliding over the bones of her hand, straight as a stitch, without slip. Night came down like a bowl set over the yard. The thin sounds vanished first. The kitchen warmed a little when I blew on the coals. She washed the tin cup in the basin. The water was just cloudy enough, the cup's face reflecting the lamp into a stale yellow halo. She wiped the cup with her shirt tail, hung it back on its nail exactly, not off by half a hole. The cup hung without sound, but its shadow turned with the lamp, each round laying on the wall a pale mark, like the trace of a child learning to write. I set the coil of rope on the cutting board, its end protruding a knuckle's length, pinned by the steel shine of the stubby knife. The knife was short, spine chipped, its edge glossy from more wiping than honing. The board was old, its grain running crosswise, the old water ring on it white as lime scale at a well's eye. The rope didn't pull back wood. I shifted the knife a little, the tip striking the iron ring that held the board. Tack. She looked up, eyes moving from the cross arm to the hanging cup, then to the bone at her neck.
Those shapes spoke to each other first, then let her hear. The back door narrowed a fraction from the wind. The latch stayed in the middle notch. The house kept the door's setting better than I did. I turned the cup on its nail so its mouth faced the lamp. The light entered, bounced back a cold spot right at the cross's head, giving the sheep's head a second eye. She set her hand on the notch, holding still. The kitchen stirred, old fat shifting in the pan, the cold body's smell from outside slipping through the crack. The night put its weight into the house. I carried the small cross to the stove. The red coals held a color everyone knew but didn't name. The fire bit into resin glue, the pitch smell covering the kitchen like a wet cloth laid over a mouth. The wood hissed along its veins, the thin black gas standing at the ceiling for a breath before it bled into the shadow. The round pin cracked and popped like old beans. I looked into the fire's eye, saw the half-curve cut on the wood complete its circle for a second, then break into ash, the shortest, cleanest break. She didn't turn, not even her eyes. At the table, she set the tin cup down, placed it exactly on the old ring, turned the base once to match the water rim with the grain. The ring read a shape, a thin cross. The cup read before the person. Next morning on the doorstep, there was another bone, smooth, fine notch, corner worn. No bootprint, no scuffed dust, no knock. The bone lay exactly where the day's first light bit into the step, lying as if it had lain there always. I picked it up. The notch fit the pad of my finger, like a nest I dug myself without remembering. In the well, the rope thocked once, the water taking the sound and holding it at the bottom. I scattered the ashes of the burned cross onto the dirt behind the porch. The char stuck to my fingers, hard to wash like dried ink. The pitch smell still hung in the house, mixed with the old milk in the forgotten jug. The house was thick with smell. The smell filled the gaps words would take. She went barefoot on the step, not stepping on the carved letters in the wood. Her toes traced a faint dust line across the new bone without touching it. Looking up, she glanced at the porch post, where I often hung the cup, then into the kitchen as if following a path already carved in the air. A dull noon, the sun still glaring but not warm. I went to the graveyard, pulled the cross from my wife's grave. The earth gripped the post tight. Grass roots twisted like the thread in an old boot seam. I shook it once. The pin clacked. My wrist stung beside the P-marked lumber. Chalk on the heads of some old pieces had faded, some new still white. Two P's close together, their tilt off by a degree, like two people reciting the same vow in two different winds. The light through the roof's crack placed a coin-shaped spot on the cross's face, right where the pin sat. That coin had lain there long, not fallen. In the house, she hung the tin cup. First day, she set the cup on the table once. Turned the base enough for the water ring to match the grain, into a cross, then lifted it. Second day, the same. Third day, the new ring overlaid the old, the rim thicker, brighter. No prayer, only motion, motion at the right time. The stubby knife lay on the board, point toward the door, like an arrow that won't run. The rope coil still under the knife, the top loop tightening with the house's damp. The pitch smell from last night's burn had dulled, but was sinking into the cloth. The right shoulder of my shirt had darkened a little, deeper than sun. I stood on the porch, heard the well rope thock once each afternoon. That sound matched the moment she set the cup down, turned the base. Inside, ring and grain kissed into a thin, true shape. Outside, the gate shadow reached the step, its head stopping exactly over my old boot print, covering it like a hand on one's own shoulder. On the fifth night, before the lamp bent, I saw on the table a new white streak, not from a water ring, a fine salt line, drawn crosswise, right at the grain crossing into a cross. I touched it with my fingertip. Salt, Didn't know from where. Didn't need to. The house had laid all the lines. I only had to walk through, without tripping on words. The next morning, she set the cup, stood straight, looked at the ring tight to the grain. Her eyes didn't shake. I felt the ring cinching faintly around the room, like the ring of a rope with no tied ends. I didn't look for the ends. I stepped onto the porch, set my hand on the post, rubbed my finger into the worn groove until my skin warm. Morality here was only the question of where to put your hand. I set it in the right place. The rest, the wood would do. The well would count, the ring would close, no one would save, no one would call. In the shed, my wife's grave cross leaned still, the chalk P on its head falling slow. Each grain of chalk fell like a grain of salt set on the tongue of someone silent. I could hear them dissolve. In the house, the cup hung straight, mouth toward the set mark. She set the cup down, turned the base, exactly one beat. The well rope thocked once. Then silence. That afternoon, the light drew into the house like a rope pulled slow. The door, open, not quite ajar, not quite wide, held at an in-between notch like the latch I often stop midway. No sound of feet. No cloth brushing walls. The fire ink held black as if just blown from the coals. In the back corner was a chalk P, still damp, its dust pool at one edge like the hand had slipped. I set my thumb to the foot of a letter. The powder stuck to my skin, leaving a faint salt taste like fresh pumped well water. Across the tabletop the grain ran diagonal. Where the lines crossed, the old pale ring's edge cupped the word like a thin moat. The chair where she often sat was skewed half a finger from the table. Its leg left a dim trail in the dust, the mark breaking right at the doorway. The cloth I'd hung on the kitchen nail still wrinkled where she often touched it. The fold holding pitch scent thinned out, with sun smell woven in like breath pulled into the belly. The tin cup still hung, mouth turned to the exact angle I'd set it last night. Its shadow on the wall was a broken gray circle, dented where the nail met it. I looked across the floor, saw specks of dust torn into thin lines toward the doorframe. Not a runner's track, a dragged shadow's track, as if someone had lifted the shape from skin and gone without leaving air behind. The lamb bone I'd set on sandpaper the night before was gone. The well rope gave no knock. The back door made no sound. The house stood, listening like an instrument with its strings just damped. I lifted the board half an inch, then set it down. No more weight than a word. The word looked up at me, black tight, not letting light through. The chalk P smeared farther under my finger. The mark lengthened like the tail of something stirring in the well. The cup on the nail spun a silent turn, the light inside shifting to smoke color. I didn't call, I didn't ask. Her name lay somewhere in the chalk, in the wood, in the absence of sound. I pushed the door a hair to change the wind's path. Outside on the porch, the dust clung to the top step higher than usual, as if someone had stood there a while without breathing. The gate's shadow reached into the house, laid across the chair, a dark stroke, as if someone had shaded it in. From the board's head, a drop of water fell. I didn't see from where, hitting the pale ring's rim, blooming into a second eye to watch the word, done. The room had remembered its arrangement without her. The road into the old desert was still there, needing no new reason. Small footprints ran parallel to the wheel rut from some past season's well hauling. The left foot sank deeper, leaving hollows dark with moisture seeping from the earth, black as brine-mixed ink. The sand at the edges rose into thin lips. The lips licked clean by wind first, showing the sharp white of dried salt. The dust spread where the trail turned, not from weight, from hesitation. The first cross showed slow because the sun was shifting. Back up the sun toward me, fresh in a cold way. thick as set egg white. The board hung square, edges sanded soft, the knot set slightly off, like a left hand remembering its place. No hair caught in resin, no blood, only wood, rope, word. The cross's shadow fell on its old ground. I stood at the edge of it, my back not yet touching the dark. The black letters turned into my pupil, writing themselves inside it like a photo glass, flipped. I shut one eye. The word reversed. Opened. The word straightened. I changed sides. The word refused to settle in one direction. The cross read me, not I it. At the base, the earth was lightly turned, revealing a dark streak like old ash blown up from beneath. I pushed it aside with my boot heel, found an old rope end buried deeper, rotted, its fibers crumbling like pulp. Beside it, a tiny bone lay in the shadow's corner, lamb-shaped, fine-notched, corner-worn, like a print pressed into the ground. No cord, no dragline, just placed. The wind passed. The bone didn't roll. The sand lifted it just enough for the notch to catch sun for a second, throwing a cold halo like water around a cup's mouth. I raised my hand toward the board's face without touching. The letters were warm to the eyes, cold to the skin. On the board's back, the half-curved blade test showed when the sidelight slid over it. Also, a perfect second. Then, gone. Perfections here lived only when untouched. They were small and didn't belong to me. A crow landed on the crossbar, turned its head twice as if counting. Its eyes were black, slick, swallowing the word without chewing. Its wings dropped dust that settled onto the cut on the board's edge, darkening the line I'd once left unfinished. The wind went through the pinhole, blowing a short note like a broken flute, a tone that couldn't finish the tune, enough for a far house to hear. The small footprints left the cross and were quickly erased, as if walked away on wind. The left foot still sank deeper, but less so, as if the muscle had relearned balance. I stood straight, carrying no word. The sun let go of the ground for a stretch, leaving fresh glue smell heavier than the old ashes. This heaviness wouldn't fade with water. It would fade with the time of objects. I stepped back, set my palm to the chest where the bone once struck. There was no object to mark the beat, but the muscle still kept the habit. A short gust placed the reversed word into the nearby well. Bubbles held it for a moment's life, then broke. The sound didn't stay. Only the glue's scent stayed in my hung on the nail, mouth turned to the lamp's beam. Blue stale on the rim, cold white in the bowl. The cup's shadow brushed a hollow circle on the wall, fitting the shadow of the sheep staff at the door. The sheep's head looked at the table, not at me. The oil on it still held the smell of that first night's polishing. Human hand scent, mixed with resin, unopened. On the table, the wood grain met into a pale cross, not from a ring, not from chalk, not from ash. Just grain, the path of a blade over seasons a man had forgotten to count. I set the board on it, letters down. The sanded edge seated tight into the grain's ridge, the lock point at the crossing. No nail, no hand. The board lay steady as a word, just finding its line. I pulled a chair, sat. The tabletop was cold against my thigh. My finger rested on the edge where the old cut was. The skin fit the wood like a seal turned to its groove. The staff at the door tilted a hair, the sheep's head catching the light, throwing a small round spot
onto the downturned board, sliding slow across the sanded edge, then dying in the dark of the grain. One eye open, one shut. The well rope knocked, thock, once, pleen. The sound ran from the stone rim, through the water, under the floor, up the table leg, placing itself on my chest as lightly as a bird's shadow passing low. Done. No second beat, no lingering echo. Just a single point of sound, standing in the room like a chalk grain uncrushed. I listened to the no sound, the sound of something holding a place for another sound. Wind passed the doorway, struck the staff's head, turned, brushed the hanging tin cup. The cup made no sound. It only flung a thin line of light like a needle, straight into the face of the downturned board. The needle was cold, without pain. It held for a beat, then dissolved like old resin scent when rain crosses the desert without touching earth. My left hand still held the chalk P mark, not washed away. The letter blurred slightly, its tail lengthening a candy's width in the sweat. I set my fingertip on it, pressed lightly into the board's edge, felt the frame's wood take to my flesh just right. The house adjusted its stance to mine. Not much, enough to stop the wood's faint hiss. In the shed, my wife's grave cross stood in shadow. Chalk P on the nearest beam's head fell a few more grains. Each grain hit the dusty floor in a sound unheard, known only by the cold. The well. A spider drew a thread across the stone lip. That thread carried morning dew in its thought, raising a bead not yet fallen. I knew the thock would come tomorrow at its hour. The house had learned the rhythm. Only the word on the board lay face down unread. I left it so. The desert road was still there, laid between two banks, no one guarded. What needed to go had gone. What needed to stay had stayed. I leaned forward for a moment, ear replaying that single sound. Sound that had come, had gone, leaving no shadow. The rope made no second call. The staff made no tap. The cup didn't fall. The board didn't slide. Everything held its place, as it had when I stepped into the afternoon. A single cold point in the chest kept the house's beat. One, then still. The lamp drew small. On the table, only the grain's thin cross remained. The board face down, the word, awake. The tin cup hung in its place. The old ring turned white as salt. On the porch the sheep staff leaned a hair, its shadow head facing the empty room. In the nose the pitch smell still. On the finger the chalk P mark still. At someone's neck a fine notched bone still shifting. If those things still stand in you, a pale ring, a burnt black word, or the well rope's sound, let them speak for themselves. Do not explain. Only set down what has stayed with you after watching. Place it like a cup set to the grain. The house will remember the beat, and at the hour, the well rope will strike once. Thock. Then still.